of SciTech. Um, and and this is our third year doing these programs. We try to offer all of our members an opportunity to listen in and get a sampling of all the exciting issues that we're all working on here within the section. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Laura Pizeski. I am the vice chair of the section, and I'm very pleased to be with all of you today. A couple matters of housekeeping. This is a webinar that is being recorded. This is not for CLE credit, but will be available after the program for viewing in case you wanted to go back and view it again, or you missed some portion of today's program. I also want to just very quickly mention before I introduce our panel for today's program, IoT and AI robotics, the future is now. We have a couple other programs coming up. On July 26th, we will have a program focused on neuroscience topics. And on August 25th, a Taste of SciTech program on quantum computing that's based on our quarterly publication, SciTech Lawyer. Just as a quick reminder, we love having all of you as members, and we encourage you to get involved, reach out to us. We have a listserv through the ABA website. We have programs just about weekly at this point, and terrific publications, both the SciTech Lawyer, which is our flagship publication, and our electronic newsletter, Emerging News, as well as an academic publication, Geometrics, among many, many other benefits we have as section members. Hopefully, in addition to that, I will just mention we have a terrific program on climate change and environmental legal issues at the annual meeting, which will be on August 4th in the morning. So if you are planning to join the section in Chicago, please consider registering for that class as well. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our illustrious panel, and I will just introduce Ruth Hilbro, who's our moderator for today's program. Ruth, thank you, and thank all of you for joining us today for this program.
Well, terrific. Thank you so much, Laura. Yes, as Laura said, I'm Ruth Bro. I've been involved with these the two national institutes that we've been going to spotlight today from the very beginning. And I'm a past SciTech chair and a past membership and diversity chair. I'm so happy that we're doing this webinar that's part of these member benefits series free to members right now. And we welcome people who are not members, encourage you to get involved in SciTech. Continually emerging technology is driving the world, and the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us of this and accelerated it. And I remember at our very first Internet of Things National Institute in 2016, Dr. Ed Felton, who was then the Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer in the White House Office of Science and Technology, had said that we've always had change, but what is unprecedented is the velocity of that change. And we're really in the age of acceleration, where rapidly and continuing emerging technology changes are raising novel legal issues that are not only important, but important to get right. So every client in every industry sector, whether it's healthcare, financial, transportation, energy, utilities, manufacturing, telecom, technology, real estate, government, national security, retail or consumer services, you name it, is being affected. And that means it affects every lawyer advising those clients. And these developments also affect us as consumers. 5G, connected devices, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, virtual and remote communications, automation of control systems, and the exponential growth in computing power are really transforming how and where all of us interact and conduct business. And there are lots of buzzwords out there that we really need to know what they mean and what legal issues they pose for us. And that's where SciTech's two national institutes come in. They're both being held virtually this year, which means there's no need to get stuck in airports, spend a lot of money on travel or hotels, or leave the comfort of your home or office. And these institutes are designed to equip attendees with some of the key technical concepts in AI and IoT, while providing really indispensable legal insights ranging from fundamentals to finer points. And the IoT National Institute, this is our seventh, which was launched in 2016. That institute will occur September 12th through the 13th. So mark it on your calendars. And then our Artificial Intelligence and Robotics National Institute, which is our fourth one, launched in January 2020, will be October 10th through 11th. After this webinar, we will follow up with an email and provide you more information about these institutes. But you can always go to the homepage of SciTech, ambar.org/SciTech, and you'll find lots of information about our past institutes and also the new ones. And both of them offer 8 hours of CLE credit, including an ethics credit, plus 4 keynotes from nationally renowned thought leaders, all for a really low price, especially for members and sponsoring entities. And we have a $49 rate for law students. So it's really terrific. Today, we're presenting you with appetizer-sized coverage of some of these hot topics that will be at our institutes. And it's going to be a fireside chat format. We purposely did not do slides. You know, if you fireside chats, you think of FDR, our president, who actually, before he was president, over 90 years ago, kind of pioneered the use of fireside chats on the radio. And their introduction was later described as a revolutionary experiment with a nascent media platform. That was radio. Today we're on Zoom and so much has changed, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So we've got in our first IoT, first panel is going to be about IoT. And we are really fortunate to have Lucy Thompson and Chris Suarez. They are going to be talking for about 20 minutes to each other. We'll be flies on the wall. And then we'll switch over to AI, where we're going to have Ted Claypool and Steve Wu discuss some of the hot topics that we need to be thinking about at these institutes. And all of these people have been involved in planning these national institutes for years. And also are leaders in publishing on these issues. So I'd like to introduce Lucy. She's the founding principal of Livingston PLLC, and she's based in Washington, D.C., focuses on her practice in cybersecurity, global data privacy, and compliance and risk management. And she helps clients develop practical solutions to prevent and respond to data breaches and secure critical infrastructure and address many complex challenges arising from new technologies. So for more than a decade, she's worked on election initiatives and voting machine security issues, very much in the news. And she's been appointed a consumer privacy ombudsman in 25 major federal bankruptcy cases. She's overseen disposition of over 250 million electronic consumer records, perhaps your own. And she was previously an engineer at CSC, a global technology company. And she worked on 2 of the government's largest technology modernization projects. While she was there, she was appointed a DHS Information System Security Officer. She was also a white crime prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice. She's also for SciTech, a past chair of the SciTech section. In fact, the year she was SciTech chair, we focused on the mobile revolution, really IoT. She's a member of the House of Delegates in the ABA for the past 18 years. And she serves on the Cybersecurity Legal Task Force, which Steve Wu and I also serve on. She's co-editor of SciTech's book on Internet of Things. I happen to have a copy here. And she co-edited that with Chris Suarez and Cindy Swick. And she also edited a data breach and encryption handbook and has contributed to the ABA Cybersecurity Handbook, a brand new edition of which is out in as of April. And I have a couple chapters in that as well. So Chris, as I said, co-authored, co-edited that Internet of Things book. He's an IP litigator at Steptoe & Johnson in DC, and he focuses his practice on high-tech patent, copyright, and trademark, trade secret trials and appeals before every level of the US court system. He's got extensive experience and provides advice and counsel on the Internet of Things. And his interest in IoT began in 2004 when he was an MIT undergraduate. He studied radio frequency identification transponders, RFID, and the implications of using RFID to pay subway fares and track hospital inventory. More recently, he, as I said, edited this IoT book. He co-chairs, he leads SciTech's IoT committee. He co-chairs the American Intellectual Property Law Association's IoT subcommittee. And he's a member of the IoT drafting team for the Sedona Conference Working Group 1, which is publishing guidance on the implications of the IoT on e-discovery. And he speaks a lot on these issues in various places. So without further ado, I'd like them to start the fireside chat on IoT.
Well, thanks, Ruth. Let's start with what is IoT? You've seen IoT everywhere in your house. You've seen smart refrigerators, home networking systems, even toilets and toothbrushes. All sorts of devices in your home are connected to the internet. And so IoT devices are or equipment that are embedded with communications technology and internet connections. Industrial IoT is another aspect where we see that in manufacturing, healthcare, agriculture, transportation. A wide range of industries are being transformed by IoT in order to increase efficiency and greatly enhance these industries. So Chris, why don't you provide some background on IoT and its development based on your work in this area?
Sure, Lucy, thanks. And thanks also to Ruth for the intros as well. Yeah, so I mean, as Ruth mentioned in sort of the introduction, you know, IoT really is a concept that goes back many, many years. And, you know, when I think of the IoT, I think of sensors. I think of things that are sensing the environment around you. I think of and actuators, right? And it really does go back to this radio frequency identification technology. When you're driving on the highway, you know, and you have an easy pass, that is paying a toll using radio frequency identification technology. You have a signal sent from a tower, it actuates the sensor and you pay your fare. Or your toll, and the same with the subways, and the same with all those hospital applications that I worked on way back in the day as an undergraduate. But back then, you know, the devices were very primitive. They had a very limited amount of data on them. A lot of times they weren't even self-powered. You had the power just came from the transmission of the radio signal itself. And so now you've had an evolution. You have a lot more devices, you know, that have sensors and actuators and can collect data. As you mentioned, Lucy, we have all these home applications now, whether it's your Ring doorbell or your smart toaster or whatever. And you also have all of these industrial applications as well, where, you know, you're looking into the supply chain and you're trying to track things, you know, for the temperature and the gravitational force on the object and all different other types of interesting applications. So, you know, so it's really exploded, and that's been facilitated by, you know, the increased bandwidth, you know, 4G, 5G, and so forth, and, you know, Moore's law and computational power increases and so forth. So it's been a very interesting evolution.
So let's consider what has changed over the years since the ABA SciTech began presenting IoT National Institutes 7 years ago. The number of IoT devices has exploded, and they're now predicted to be more than 25 billion connected devices. So from a cybersecurity standpoint, this means that the attack surfaces that hackers can use to compromise systems and networks has greatly increased. The cyber insurance market has been upended with the proliferation of attacks using IoT devices and ransomware using these devices to shut down systems all over the world. In litigation, liability is being defined because many entities are involved in the IoT ecosystem. And if there's a problem or harm occurs, it's difficult to decide who's responsible. And new standards of care are being developed by NIST and other organizations, as well as FTC case decisions. Internationally, the EU and countries have passed IoT laws, and global regulatory compliance has stepped up. So 7 years ago, we were just contemplating these things, and now they've actually come into being. So Chris, from your standpoint, what do you think has changed over these years?
Yeah, so I think you know, you're hitting it on the head. I mean, there is just so many more IoT devices. You know, this was more of a theoretical thing, you know, 20 years ago, where you had some very small applications, but now it really is everywhere. And to your point, like, there weren't any laws on the books about this issue, you know, 20 years ago or even 5 years ago. But to your point, like in 2020, we had the passage of the IoT Cybersecurity Act, and that was partially in response to these concerns about, I think you alluded to, like, these distributed denial of service attacks, right? Where, you know, people try to overload the systems, and because there's so many IoT devices, some of which don't have very strong security, especially in the consumer IoT, there have been some issues with that. You know, there's been some concern from the federal government about making sure those things are secure. And so you have executive orders from Biden that came out in 21, and you have this IoT Cybersecurity Act, which are trying to use the federal government and contracts with the federal government to kind of set some minimum standards. You also mentioned NIST, right? And they're engaging in some efforts to create floors and standards for the minimum cybersecurity requirements. So I think what's really changed is that there has been more of a awareness of these IoT issues, more tangible laws that have been created, and more of a recognition that this is going to be something that is a real issue, but an opportunity as well. It's super exciting that you know, all of the data collection opportunities and efficiency gains that can be unleashed from having all this IoT data. So there's some challenges, but there's also amazing opportunities with it as well.
Well, speaking of opportunities, what does this mean for you as lawyers and your legal practice? There's some challenging questions about how lawyers can comply with ethical issues, because in legal offices, and for those of you who are back to work, you'll find IoT devices throughout the offices that can often be entry points for hackers, or cause problems in confidentiality. So in order to comply with legal standards, lawyers need to be much more careful about how their sensitive client data is handled. Most clients are facing a myriad of complex issues precipitated by IoT, such as managing risk and potential liability. And in the upcoming IoT National Institute, we'll be delving in depth into many of these issues. And there's much to learn here. But because surveys have shown that cybersecurity is on everybody's priority list, and with respect to IoT, many people think that cyber is a barrier to the expansion and use of IoT. So what are some of the threats and problems in this area? Interestingly, criminals used a thermometer and a fish tank to compromise the entire network of a major Las Vegas casino and stole the personal data of its high-end clients. So this tiny little device is only one example of the kinds of things that can be used to bring down your entire network. And industrial control systems have been under attack. Hackers tried to unleash the water in a dam in New York by compromising the software controls. And so-called smart locks have been on the radar of the FTC among many cases. In that case, they found that companies were using unencrypted passwords that invalidated the security of the smart lock systems. And ransomware is exploiting vulnerabilities in IoT devices and is being used to shut down entire company networks, as Chris just mentioned. And very concerning, IoT devices have been compromised to create botnet armies used for large-scale denial of service attacks that Chris mentioned to paralyze and shut down entire hospital record-keeping systems and internet service providers. So internet-connected cameras, home routers, air quality monitors can be used as the vehicles to significantly harm organizations all over the world. So Chris mentioned the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation drafted by Senator Mark Warner and others in Congress. And 6 years ago, that law was just being contemplated. Now it's being copied in some states, including Oregon and California, who have passed laws strictly regulating IoT devices. So the legislative arena is really coming to life. And the executive order that Chris mentioned, called the Executive Order on Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity, looks at a new way of focusing on the cybersecurity risks of IoT devices using zero trust architecture. And you'll hear about this at the IoT National Institute, where the assumption is that every device and every actor trying to gain access to the system is untrusted. And focus is being put on all of these IoT devices to create more robust security. So let's delve into some of the specific issues that come up with IoT. So Chris, you've been working on supply chain, and congratulations on your article in the SciTech Lawyer. So tell us about the supply chain issues and also about the SciTech Lawyer as a member benefit to SciTech members.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I got an interest in the supply chain because I do think it's one of the most practical and robust applications of IoT that is possible. And there's actually been some studies about how, this is going to be a huge unlocking of the of value for the IoT because when you have this robust data, you're able to optimize, the sort of supply chain processes. You're able to find gaps. If you imagine the COVID vaccines being transported along the supply chain, they have to be at a certain temperature, having sensors that can track that can save lives, literally. And you could find so many ways to improve efficiency using that. So that's what kind of inspired me. Those types of issues inspired me to write this article because, you've got supply chain issues that are implicated by the IoT, and they span IP, they span e-discovery, they span all kinds of issues about product labeling and safety and so much more. So I was very grateful to SciTech for giving me the opportunity to publish an article on those issues. And, both being a benefit of being in the section is both to receive the SciTech Lawyer magazine, which I found valuable over the years, but also the fact that anyone who is a member can, pursue an article opportunity and learn about these issues. And I found it to be a great opportunity to collaborate. I was able to collaborate with several folks throughout the industry, from IBM and the telecom industry and others who I've met over the years who share this passion for IoT and are, acutely aware of the fact that supply chain and, as you mentioned, Lucy, automation is going to be another important issue. I briefly mentioned e-discovery, and there was a famous case a few years ago where someone's Amazon Alexa was subpoenaed in a criminal case. And the information from that device was relevant to the conviction. As time progresses, everyone thinks about the cybersecurity, but we're also going to have to think about, as we have more IoT devices, is there going to be data on those that's discoverable and might be relevant to proceeding? And when we're doing discovery as litigators, we're often thinking about the emails and the traditional documents, but we're not thinking so much about these other potential sources of information that are going to be really relevant. And we're also not always thinking about the fact that these technologies can really advance the ball and be innovative, and so there might be IP implications such as patent and trade secrets. So there are a lot of exciting opportunities, and I hope folks will check out the article to kind of see some of the thoughts we shared on these important issues, and encourage you, if you are a member of SciTech, to read the SciTech Lawyer, because it is a great member benefit.
So your article sounds like a great reference. Another issue that we haven't touched on yet is privacy, because IoT sensors are generating vast amounts of personal data about everybody's behavior. The energy efficiency systems in people's houses are going to reveal people's comings and goings and when they're there, and potentially create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by criminals. Connected cars is another area where, in order to operate, they need to know that who is the driver and who are the passengers in the cars and track their locations. This can be devastating for people who want to have confidential gatherings in their cars, so to speak. And IoT devices can be used for surveillance in good ways, potentially by law enforcement, but also can be misused because smart cameras are seemingly everywhere. In cities, license plate readers are being used in DC, for example, at every single entrance to the city. So people are being tracked, their every movement. And finally, we need to wrap up so we can get to the AI issues, but new standards of care are being created, as Chris mentioned, by NIST and the FTC cases. Contracting is being transformed, particularly with all these third-party business partners and vendors being involved in IoT work. So Chris, why don't you wrap up with any final thoughts, and then we'll look forward to Ted and Steve's discussion of AI.
Yeah, great, Lucy. Yeah, and I would just say my final thought is maybe a natural transition to the AI folks as something to leave them with, and I'm wondering if they can comment on it during the course of their portion of the fireside chat, which is, obviously the opportunity that IoT presents is you have all of these sensors and you're collecting so much data, and with that data, comes the opportunity for AI types of applications, because you with a robust data set, you're able to train the data and make predictions of how to maybe optimize your supply chain or optimize automation in a factory and all of those kind of things. So, so I think there's an interesting interplay between the IoT and its, emphasis on data collection and some of the AI issues that I'm sure that Steve and Ted are going to talk about in the next portion. So I'll just kind of leave it with that, because I think there's a fascinating interplay there that that can be a nice transition.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy and Chris. That was a whirlwind tour of some of the hot IoT issues. And now we're going to shift over to our AI fireside, but I would remind you that you can post questions in the chat box. and we'll address those at the end of the program. Today, in fact, I saw just a few days ago in the Washington Post, there was an editorial by the editorial board calling more and more artificial intelligence is keeping the world under watch. We're just seeing more and more coverage of how both AI and IoT are really tracking more of our lives than we imagine. And so I'd like to introduce the next two speakers. Steve Wu is a shareholder with Silicon Valley Group, where he advises clients on cutting edge information technologies such as AI, automated vehicles, robotics, mobile computing, cloud computing, big data, human computer interfaces, and IoT. Steve founded our AI and Robotics National Institute and has chaired it since its inception. He's a longstanding SciTech leader, including serving as SciTech's 2010-2011 section chair. And he's also SciTech's representative on the ABA Cybersecurity Legal Task Force. He's the author of the ABA's 2016 book, Guide to HIPAA Security in the Law. And he's written or co-written 6 other books on information security in the law. And in 2019, he wrote book chapters for ABA publications on AI and robotics product liability and the legal issues of connected vehicle systems. He's also served as in-house counsel, including at VeriSign. And then Ted, he has been involved with our AI institutes from the start. He's a former in-house data and technology counsel for Bank of America and for CompuServe. He now leads Womble Bond Dickinson's IP transactions and fintech teams. And clients call on Ted to help manage, protect, and profit from information. His practice really spans all of the information economy. He helps companies design data analytics strategies and comply with relevant laws and contracts. And privacy and cybersecurity are the starting points for client advice on data collected through transactions, online interactions, and IoT, and with an emphasis on payments and financial activity. He speaks a lot and writes a lot on these topics. He recently served as editor of the ABA book called The Law of Artificial Intelligence and Smart Machines. He also authored 2 books from Roman and Littlefield publishers titled Privacy in the Age of Big Data and Protecting Your Internet Identity. Are You Naked Online? So Steve and Ted, we're going to be flies on the wall listening to your fireside chat.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Really appreciate you having us today. And one of the things besides Ted writing this book, and it's a terrific book, Law of Artificial Intelligence and Smart Machines. It's very comprehensive, has a lot of content, more content that I've seen in other books. But Ted also, as part of the outgrowth of that book, had a podcast series. And one of the podcast topics, one of the first podcast topics he talked about is, what is artificial intelligence? So Ted, after all the podcasts you did, what was your upshot about that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, you have to kind of look back and see how it's always been defined, which is that artificial intelligence is the technology of the future, and it always will be. There's a certain point of it that is describing things that we would like to see, but we haven't seen yet. But, after listening to that great presentation by Lucy and Chris, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that what they're describing is the eyes of the beast, and what we're describing is the brain of the beast. In order to do things and understand what you're seeing and what you can do with it and manage with it, you need both. And so there is no such thing as general AI as of yet, which would be
general
something,
meaning like, it's human level, being able to think the way that humans would.
right? Anything from Frankenstein on up to HAL 9000. All the things we've talked about are seen in on television and movies and in books, that isn't here, and it's may not get here for many, many, many years, despite what Google engineers might think. How would you define it?
Well, it is a branch of computer science, and maybe one of the shorthand things that I say in my presentations is it's machine simulating features of human intelligence. And that's a good way of looking at it. There's also this understanding that when you have an AI system, it takes in data through maybe these IoT sensors that Lucy and Chris were talking about, and then it has some kind of reasoning reaction, not human thinking, but trying to make sense of that and then taking action in response to that. So like
let me throw out very quickly. I mean, some of that is because there's some things that it's very good at. For example, gathering large bits of data and then sorting them or differentiating one piece from another piece. And so a lot of what we have that are excellent AI applications deal with things like that, dealing with large sets of data and then sorting them, dividing them, grouping them in different ways that we might not have considered. So there's things AI is good at, and there's things that it may not be as good.
Yeah, and to give you an example of what Ted was just talking about, like a very simple example is putting a lot of data into a system, like pictures of cats and dogs, and then the next picture to come along, the machine says, is this a cat or is this a dog? So that there's that kind of thing, and then making predictions and saying probabilities. So those are the kinds of things that AI might be good at. I was saying perception, reasoning, and action, like an autonomous vehicle, it takes in a lot of data through LiDAR, through cameras and radar, and then it figures out where am I relative to the road, where am I relative to the map, and then based on that, uses the brake, throttle, and steering in order to move the car from point A to point B. That would be an example of that. We shall also talk about robots, since this is AI and Robotics National Institute, and I don't want to ignore that too. But robotics is this field of computer science again, or engineering, or both, and thinking about creating these complex machines that have a physical presence that do complicated tasks. And sometimes they are externally controlled. You may think of a drone, or they are acting autonomously, like other types of drones. And there's other types of machines like autonomous vehicles that are acting autonomously as well. So you want to talk a little more about robotics?
Yeah, I think we can't forget the cars. I mean, that's really the one where I think it may affect many of us. We're already seeing delivery robots. It's doubtful that we will see robots that can do your dishes for you, because that's actually
anytime soon. Although we're working on
anytime soon, there may be, but it's one of those things where, and I say this because it helps us think about robotics, because doing the dishes, one is somewhat of a minor task. So in other words, there's not willing. Well, right. Well, minor in that nobody wants to pay $1 billion to create a machine for themselves that will do that. But that said, it's a difficult task, because you've got to have something that can identify, pick up, manipulate breakable things, and do what you want with them, and then leave them where they're supposed to be. That's actually hard from a physical standpoint.
Yeah.
So,
and it's worth mentioning, even just the engineering problem of having this grasp of to be able to pick up a plate or a glass cup without shattering it. That's
right. What they call a soft touch, or with a dog, a soft mouth. They say that certain retrievers have a soft mouth so they can grab something but not crush it while they're doing it. That's hard for a machine to do. So a lot of the things we'll see are going to be doing the easier things that physical machines can do, like bring you a pizza, for example.
Right. But I should say, just really quickly, you mentioned the autonomous vehicles. That's the interplay between robotics and artificial intelligence, because it is a robot, but it's powered by AI. But there are lots of other examples. It's good to see examples of it, so you have a concrete idea of what AI and robotics are. Like I was on the University of Pittsburgh campus, and I saw the little delivery robot that was going around the street and can hold like 2 bags of groceries, and those can either be autonomous or remote. There's the warehouse robots that moves packages back and forth so people don't throw out their backs. The security robot that goes through the Westfield Mall near where I live, the sensors will take in the video and provide alerts if something goes amiss. The robotic lawnmowers and vacuum cleaners out there. The San Francisco airport, when I came back to that trip from Pittsburgh as a college visit, has this kiosk where has this robotic arm that can make like 300 different types of coffee drinks. But I guess, people are used to dealing with artificial intelligence because they've got this, right? And you talk to Siri and you ask Siri, what's the height of Mount Everest or something like that, and it will provide a response to you. That's called a chatbot. Bank of America has this Erica app that you can check the status of your savings account. What's my savings account balance? There are artificial intelligence systems to ferret out fraud and foreign corrupt practices, to do investigations, electronic discovery, figuring out what people are going to buy in the retail setting or what people want to watch on a streaming service, and then on and on. So those are kinds of examples of AI and robotics.
Right, and I mean, to tie some of that back together with what we were talking about earlier, if you think about the suggestions for what you might want to read next, or some of the other examples that Steve was giving, once again, these are very good examples of grouping. The fraud programs, for example, the bank looks at where your credit card is being used and says, Steve has not been in Pittsburgh before. This may flag as a thing that Steve is not doing, but somebody else has the credit card, so that may call into question and send him an email. So once again, that kind of grouping and prediction and identification is really what we're talking about. I mean, and let me just end with one quick thing, which is that I think not many people who know AI were surprised that IBM bought the Weather Channel, right? Why would you think somebody that was interested in AI would want the Weather Channel? Huge amounts of data and things that you can group, things that you can predict. And so a lot of data that they can build their AI and machine learning on.
Yeah. Well, let's switch to some of the topics that we're going to be covering during the Institute, October 10th and 11th. Please save the date. One of the things that I think will be a panel is we're going to talk about how AI can create a fantasy world. You can create this feeling that maybe you're talking to a real person. And it actually came into news because there's a guy named Blake Lemoine, who was a Google engineer, who was his work was kind of put on hold after he had interacted with the thing that he was working with, which is Google's language model for dialogue application, or Lambda for short. And he started saying to management that he thinks it's become sentient, and that was sort of maybe you could say it's a fantasy in his mind, but it was a real concern because he's interacting with it, and it just seems like it's interacting in such a deep and detailed and rich way that it seemed like it was sentient. What was your take on that, Ted?
Well, I mean, there's a big difference between sounding like you're interacting in the conversation in the right way and actually having the thought behind it. And this is I think somewhat probably a bad thing to bring up, but I mean, my mother has Alzheimer's. My mother can't remember what she said 2 minutes ago, but she is a highly skilled conversationalist. So if you didn't know well enough, you could go through a good 10-minute conversation and feel like she was participating actively. But I know she's not, and so is my sister. But same thing with some of these machines. They're going to get better and better and better at seeming like they're human, but that doesn't mean that what you're seeing and hearing actually has thought behind it. It simply has the ability to react to a certain kind of input in a way that we find familiar.
Right. And I agree with that, but I'll also add that it seems like, and we're going to talk about this in the Institute, there are two tracks of thought in my mind about thinking about artificial intelligence. There's the short run, like what's here today, and then there's the long run, what could we have in the future? And what Lemoine is really getting at is something that I think is going to be a long-term issue. And if you ask, why did you get involved in artificial intelligence laws? Because I think long-term, and this may be long after we're retired or gone or what have you, this is going to be the most important field of law in the future. It's going to change the direction of the human species. You can't really say that about other areas of law, but
No, I agree.
Focusing on the here and now, it's not realistic what he's talking about. It's not what's going on. In my view, and we're a little bit jumping the gun with some of that, but yet I think in order to be prepared for what's going to happen in the future, we have to have one eye on this, the long run future, and make sure that we don't get caught flat-footed. But today in our institute is going to focus almost completely on what's here and now today, and what can you put into practice regarding artificial intelligence?
Right. And Steve, I mean, and once again, I was struck by the Internet of Things discussion about how similar it is to where we are right now. This is what, the 4th year of the AI Institute.
Yeah.
And while we always try and have 1 or 2 talks that are very forward looking, I mean, what do we see that's in the metaverse? What do we see that is upcoming and exciting? There's a lot that what we're doing that is very much today what lawyers are going to have to know ethically about AI, because 37 states have a requirement for lawyers to have a competence, I mean, written into the rules, that lawyers have to have competence in the technology that they're using, or that their clients are using, and what's in front of them. That's important. We have contractual issues that we're talking about. We have exciting and interesting issues. Like I'm sort of surprised in the last year or two, we haven't seen more deep fakes. And that's an area that I know you're planning to talk about.
Yeah, that'll be part of this program about creating a fantasy world. And there was a story in the ABA Journal a couple of years ago about family lawyers needing to watch out for deepfake evidence, like the spouse who creates the synthetic audio showing the other spouse being abusive towards children, and introducing this as evidence against the other spouse. So this is, creating this fantasy world is going to be a legal issue. I think we should also, along your lines of ethics, maybe our ethics program can get into this question about how much does a lawyer really need to know about artificial intelligence in order to be competent, and what's the role of the expert, what's the role of the lawyer, and how do you make sure that you remain competent with the challenge of these being highly complex fields?
Well, and one of the areas that you have to think about in this is if you're offering AI as evidence, or you're offering the result that a machine learning vehicle has recorded and has come up with itself. First of all, if it's a black box issue, what does that mean, and can you actually cross-examine it? Because you need to be able to cross-examine in order to have a fair trial. So,
and we're going to be
how
looking
is
at
that done?
Employment questions, and we'll have an employment panel, and like, what's the disparate impact of these black box systems? But before we go too far, I did want to mention on June 9th in the Northern District of California, there's a case that was filed called Spence versus Meta, and it's essentially a product liability case claiming that artificial intelligence systems with Meta's Instagram is creating addiction, anxiety, depression, self-harm, eating disorders, and ultimately suicidal ideation. So this, the liability and thinking about the way that you can get drawn into this fantasy world could lead to legal liability.
Absolutely. Well, and it reminds me of what had just happened in Europe, whereas there was an interesting court finding that threw out an AI system because they couldn't establish that it could protect people's privacy while doing its job. And they said it's essentially the responsibility of the company, or in this case, government agency that wants to use the AI system to show that it properly protects privacy. Mm-hmm. And really, I mean, Europe is on the cutting edge of creating law in this space. And, they already have a law in the books that essentially says that you can sue if you feel like there were decisions made about you affecting your life that were made by machines, and you didn't have the ability to object to it.
Yeah, one of the panels that we're going to talk about is about the reliability of data, including in the healthcare context. Another panel, your discussion about privacy is a good segue, because we will talk about the newly proposed American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which I think, if it gets passed, will become the most important AI piece of legislation in our history in the United States. And it's interesting, like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, Privacy and Security Law in Europe, has created this crossover between AI and privacy. We'll have a panel on AI and security. And one of the things, Section 207 of the proposed act is really key in terms of AI. And among other things, it talks about, after the date of the act, a covered entity, meaning subject to FTC jurisdiction, that knowingly develops an algorithm to process, transfer covered data shall evaluate the design of the algorithm, including any training data used to develop the algorithm to reduce the risk of potential harms. So I think this is going to start this ball rolling in terms of regulations, and we're going to watch to see whether this new law is passed. Not only does it have a path-breaking privacy aspect of it, creating this first national privacy regime, but it also has an AI aspect to it too.
Well, and it hits back to and I know we need to go in a second, but it hits back to what the FTC has ruled at the beginning of the year, which is that if you improperly used data that was improperly gathered, at least from a privacy standpoint, to train and test your AI, then the FTC has said, we're not going to allow you to use that AI. You have to chuck the whole thing and start over with the appropriate data. So this is stuff that is affecting business right now, and it's legal requirements that are coming into being as we sit here.
Yeah, and the FTC just put out a guidance document on AI that I think might be useful for folks, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. But anyway, we've run out of time. There's so much more that we could talk about, and there's so much more that we will talk about the Institute. So hope that you can make it on October 10th and 11th online.
Well, that was terrific, Ted and Steve. These are just a sampling of the many topics we're going to be talking about. And on the IoT side, I have a panel that on privacy issues called Privacy in the Multiverse of Madness, Protecting Data in Real Life in the Metaverse. And, Ted was just mentioning the FTC approach to these issues. The FTC is really going after much more aggressively abuse of data, going beyond traditional concepts, and in not just upping fines and things like that, but really taking away the data in a way that you don't have your data, you don't have your business. So it really there are some significant shifts in response to technology, very concerned about AI algorithms. They highlighted this at the last Privacy Con that they had in July, and there's another one coming up. So I would encourage you to check out the FTC site, and it's a free virtual conference in that regard. We have had some questions come in, so I just want to queue those up. And for all the panelists, so all of the panelists, please come back on camera and unmute yourselves. And the first question that came in, are the panelists aware of any interesting recent or upcoming USSC decisions involving IoT data or devices? And Chris, I'm wondering if you might know, since you're on the kind of litigation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything that's directly on point for IoT data or devices right now. I would say that the Oracle v. Google decision from the U.S. Supreme Court was very interesting in that it, looked at the fair use doctrine in the context of software code. And I think that's an issue that may be implicated in future IoT disputes because there's a lot of software that drives the IoT. And there's a lot of cases right now that are coming up in the world of sort of data scraping and gathering data. And there's been some interesting cases like in the 11th Circuit and some other circuits. There's a case called like the CompuLife case that in the 11th Circuit that talked about data scraping and how that can implicate copyright or trade secret or some of those types of issues. So there's nothing right now that I would say is perfectly on point, but I think there's some ambiguity in how the sort of collection of data is going to be treated under some of these IP laws and doctrines. And I could see there being more cases, not necessarily in the patent area, but in the copyright, trade secret sort of data area that kind of create some really interesting issues. So so there's nothing right now, but I could see there being some in the future.
Yeah.
Ruth, if I could jump in,
Sure.
again, sort of following on what Chris is saying, there may be sort of indirect effects. There's a case called Van Buren versus United States that was talking about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And that was picked up by the 9th Circuit in HiQ versus LinkedIn, which is talking about data scraping. And, like Clearview AI, cases against Clearview AI, class actions against Clearview AI, complained that Clearview had scraped the public internet for images, like 3 million images or something like that. And so web scraping is going to be a big issue. And whether it's a breach of contract or whether it's a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act or state analogs, I think if you steer from Van Buren to HiQ case and cases like that, then you get into the AI area. But Van Buren was about police officer having unauthorized access to records, or the claim was that it was the police officer had unauthorized access to records. But it ended up getting used in the scraping case. So scraping is a big issue when it comes to AI, and where you got the data that you're using to train your AI systems.
Yeah, and also where you're putting the data, right? Because so a lot of these data scraping cases, they involve websites on the public internet, but there might be protection in how this data is aggregated on the internet. But the companies may have an interest in still having the data out there and not under lock and key. So it'll be interesting to see how companies collect IoT data, and they might either have it be public facing or not public facing. And then what does that implicate in terms of some of these IP data scraping, privacy, and so forth issues?
Yeah. Yeah, somebody else sent in a comment saying, to Ted's point, it would be very interesting to read some decisions, not only in collection of information by IoT, but also on how IoT output is processed and disseminated with AI. They're very much commingled in many ways. I mean, in the IoT Institute, you'll hear a lot about AI, and in the AI Institute, you're going to hear a lot about IoT. Any further thoughts from the panel on that?
I think to go to Chris's point, for a lot of AI systems, you could ask the question, well, where'd you get your data? Well, we got the data from the IoT sensors.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so there's there's going to be a lot of that kind of activity going on.
There is,
Yeah.
but it's also true that we're early in these stages. In other words, we're seeing some things like with Clearview and dealing with facial recognition systems, which have both IoT and AI implications. But a lot of this stuff hasn't flowed all the way to get a decision yet. And so I think we're going to see more of that over the next couple of years, but we haven't seen a lot yet.
Yeah, one other interesting thing that did happen, though, that I should comment on, and as an IP lawyer, I'd be remiss to not say it, is there was a recent case in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit about whether an AI can be an inventor on a U.S. patent. And the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit said, no, it cannot be, based on the plain text of the statute. But there has been an individual who's been on a crusade to try to convince various countries to recognize AI as an inventor.
Right,
I'm sure Steve and Ted, you know
failed.
that. So.
Has generally failed in Europe and the US.
Yes.
And this was the chapter that I wrote in that AI and robotics book. And I've since revised my my thoughts on this, which is that AI should not get any kind of legal rights until it has something it wants. Right. And that's not really how we think about rights and responsibilities, but all of our rights and responsibilities are built for humans, which have short lifespans and desires. And so why even give something rights if it doesn't actually want anything?
Yeah.
We'll have an update on those patents that Chris is talking about in our program.
Yep.
Right. And we've had a couple other questions come in. What do speakers think about the legal repercussions, such as an IP resulting from the rollout of new generative art models, such as DALL-E2, which create realistic images?
And we are going to be covering that in the AI Institute as well. We have a whole IP group. Steve, you want to talk about the detail?
Well, I think, yeah, we're going to delve into what happens when you have these synthetic creations, not just in the metaverse, not just with non-fungible tokens, but also just in general. I sat through an interesting presentation at the business law section meeting in March of 2019, where one of the speakers talked about people taking old Rembrandt paintings, having an AI system digest all those and trying to create new masterpieces in the style of Rembrandt. So the question is, what's the copyright implication of that? So I don't have any answers for that, but that's one of the topics that we'll be dealing with.
Well, we know in music it would be a problem because of a recent decision where they said that They awarded millions of dollars for capturing the mood of a Marvin Gaye song, even though it didn't use any of the notes.
Yeah. And another question, what do speakers think about the possible customer lock-in issues for huge IoT enthusiasts where all of their home devices are in an ecosystem which doesn't allow for easy data portability or change of service provider?
Yeah, there's really interesting. I mean, this goes back to the classic issue of walled gardens versus interoperability, right?
Right.
And I think that's going to be a continuing conversation in the IoT. Where do you draw the lines? Because the more interoperable things are, the more you have risk, but the more opportunities there are for interesting applications and efficiency and so forth. So I think this goes back to the sort of efforts to have some standardization through NIST and some of these other organizations. And so I think we're gonna see more and more standardization efforts as time goes on, so that there are fewer of these walled gardens. But with that is going to come all of the issues of who gets the standard, and standard essential patents might be more relevant in issues like that. So I mean, but again, these are conversations that I think are going to be increasingly realistic now as you see more and more IoT applications.
Well, the time has really flown by. I'd like to end with one last question. Ted said aptly that IoT is the eyes of the beast and AI is the brains of the beast. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists to give us their tweet length versions of what do you think attorneys have to know about the beast from an AI robotics perspective or from an IoT perspective. So Lucy, I'll start with you. What are your top points, takeaways?
I think people need to understand how IoT and AI work, and they need to have enough understanding of the technology so that they can make considered judgments and provide good advice to clients. I always say you can't solve a problem you don't understand. So if you thought you went to law school and we're not interested in technology, now's the time to rethink that problem, because understanding the technology in some depth is very important.
Terrific. Chris, how about you?
Yeah, I'd agree with what Lucy just said, and just add that people need to understand that this technology is here now, that it is a real thing. This is not something that's theoretical anymore. Like there are real applications of the IoT that are around you each and every day. And so that should motivate you to do the things that Lucy suggested, to understand it, because it's going to be very relevant more and more over the years.
So true. Ted, what do we need to know about the beast?
I think we need to know, I don't think we need to know exactly how it works or in details or be engineers, but I do agree with Lucy. We need to know that it exists, and what Chris is saying, where it is and how to spot it. So to be able to say, oh, that is an IoT device and it took a certain amount of information, and that's an IoT enabled trash can. So there was some measurement involved in it. There was connectivity involved. The basics, I think we're going to need to know what's there and that it's happening and where it is affecting us in our lives.
Terrific. And Steve, you get the final word on the beast.
When I lead these programs, my 4-part mantra of key takeaways is: 1, the technology is here, as the others were saying. This is something real, it's not science fiction. 2, these technologies will have a profound impact on our society. As time goes on, the rate of change will just accelerate, as Lucy was talking about earlier. The third is, because of these profound effects on our world and the way we live our lives, there will be profound legal implications of this. We need to be prepared for those legal implications, and as lawyers, we need to tackle them. And 4, every single one of us will play some role in helping the rollout and development and deployment and use of ethical, legal, and compliant AI and robotic systems and other technology systems.
Well, that is wonderful. Our time has flown by. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will follow up with an email to give you more information about the Institute. And I think that Chris Suarez article in SciTech Lawyer. Please feel free to reach out to us if we can be of help anyway. My name's ruth.hill.bro@gmail.com. You can send me a note and I can share it with our panelists. So thank you so much. And I hope you'll join us for the next SciTech, Taste of SciTech webinar. And thank you for participating.
And a quick shout out, thank you to all of the panelists today. We really appreciate you taking your time to share your expertise with us. We've gotten terrific feedback already in the comments. Thanks everyone. Have a terrific 4th of July holiday. Come back for next month's program.